Welcome to the Beltway Broadcast, the premier podcast for the workplace learning and talent development professionals of the Association for Talent Development's Metro DC chapter. We've got some great resources in store for you today.
Hello, fellow ATDers. I'm Christina Eanes, the 2023 Vice President of Marketing and Communications.
Hey, everyone. I'm Stephanie Hupka, and I am the 2023 Vice President of Membership and Outreach, as well as a member of the Pod Squad here at the Metro DC chapter of ATD.
We also have Helena Hodges, Vice President of Finance and Operations, as our producer. For this episode, we are interviewing Mark Sheppard. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, before we jump into our topic of short notice training projects, which I'm sure none of us have ever had before.
Never once, no.
Can you share
what this is?
Can you share a little bit about your background with our listeners and viewers?
Sure. I, like a lot of other folks in learning and development, have got a fairly eclectic background and found myself on this career path, which wasn't one I expected when I was doing aptitude tests in high school and things like that. But I realized this year I've actually been at learning and development in some capacity or another for just over 35 years.
Wow.
And it's been a pretty rich mix of environments to work in, everything from corporate IT training. I used to work for a major Microsoft training partner in Toronto, through to pharmaceutical work, healthcare, IT environments, in one instance specifically IT for healthcare, through to military aviation maintenance training. So
wow,
it's been a rich mix, and so I've worked everywhere from from being the solopreneur inside an organization to having to basically run a department of one, through to being part of really great teams in some environments, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm currently on contract with General Motors Canada, working in an engineering group, trying to formalize training for a couple of specific engineering disciplines.
Wow. So you've probably had a lot of experience with short notice training projects.
Just a few.
Just a few. Yeah. So, I mean, with this topic, I mean, where do we need to go first with this?
I think the important thing for people to know is that short notice projects are going to happen. And just so that we're all on the same kind of playing field, a short notice project is one that I define that's got a very, very short deadline. So some folks say, well, does that mean that somebody should give me lots of lead time if I just need to spool up a quick reference guide? No. If they're asking for it in 5 minutes, yes. But if you're being asked to do something that's extensive, you're asked to be doing something that's interactive and it's got a pretty short deadline, that's what I classify as short notice. And they do happen. In some instances, these are situations that are forced upon you. For example, if you're in an industry that's dealing with regulatory issues and there's a regulatory change, or there's a shift in business strategy as a result of some kind of change in direction, these things are going to happen. It's probably also fair to say that a lot of these things come from poor planning. Now, where the blame for that planning resides, I'm not going to go there. But in a number of cases, it is a lack of planning, and that sort of leads to a larger conversation about sort of where L&D fits in and their presence in the business and all that kind of thing. Sometimes I think speaking in what I'd like to hope is a safe space amongst L&D folks is that we don't always get the voice that we need to have. We're often an afterthought for change initiatives and things like that. So, like I said, that's a bigger discussion, but you're not going to get away from them, but there are things you can do to mitigate. There are conversations that you can engage in to help ensure that you're still providing the best possible solution in spite of pretty tight constraints.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, that's actually where I wouldn't mind starting. So I realized there are kind of two paths that we can navigate, and I suspect we're probably going to take both of them over the course of our conversation. One of them is certainly the how do you do this? How do you take these short-term projects or these last-minute requests and turn them into something great? Because it certainly can be done. And I think a lot of us have probably done the best we could and maybe even got to mission accomplished on some of those. But the tougher one is how you handle the fact that you're getting these requests at all. So knowing that there are good cases where you're going to get them, I'd love to start with the cases where maybe there aren't such good reasons. Maybe it's more of a, like a repeat offender who might stop by your desk and say, hey, yeah, I need something from you in 2 weeks. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or maybe even strategies that you've used or seen work well for how to maybe approach some of these behaviors, help to change some of these behaviors so that you might start limiting some of these requests and give yourself the lead time you need.
I think that's a good place to start as well. And one of the things that I've learned, particularly from speaking on, from having spoken about this topic in a number of venues, is that you really need to learn to ask good questions when these requests come down the pipe, and those questions can range to anything from, which of my current projects would you like me to pause so that I can take this on?
Oh, I love that.
Or what are the risks if we don't meet this arbitrary deadline?
Yep.
That's a big one. Because we need to know what happens if it doesn't work the way it was requested. And also, what might the requester be willing to, I don't want to say sacrifice, but what are they willing to live with in terms of outputs and eventual outcomes because of this short deadline? I think gentle pushback is not necessarily a bad thing. We all have a lot of stuff going on, and having a little bit of excitement like this dropped into your work schedule is unfortunate. As I said, it's going to happen, but you need to be able to roll with the request and see what's possible, and that's sort of on the external side. On the internal side, one of the things that I learned, particularly on the project that was the core of my talk about learning from failure, is that you start to learn what's possible when you're pushed, when you have no choice but to provide some measure of success. What are the things that can happen? And that's anything from discovering that, let's say, procuring laptops for people to assist you with a project doesn't have to take 3 months of lead time. You can actually have them made available for you in a few days. You can also say, hey, look, we determined that we've got people who can assist us when we have projects like this. If everybody buys in and says, yes, this is absolutely something that we need to do, how can I help? So there are some positives that can come out of it, and it forces you to think really creatively. And this is where I'm really happy to have had background in design thinking and ideation and putting ideas forth to see what works, and to really come up with some different ways to accomplish what you've been asked to do.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, and so jokingly, with my folks, I would normally say, training 911, how may we help you with your poor planning today? But not jokingly, one of the other things that I would do is try almost to proactively reach out to those serial offenders. I want to get your thoughts on this too. And see, like, so monitor kind of the horizon, a new law just got enacted, going and talking to that person. Is there any kind of training that you're planning on sending down the pike on this, or, checking in with them on a regular basis? Is there any training coming down that you think we need to be aware of so we can start gathering our resources, that kind of thing. And what are your thoughts on that?
That's very true. And one of the other things that I would add to that is the concept of sponsorship and advocacy for learning and development. If you're in a position to where you are, sort of in the middle and trying to change things from the middle, that's very difficult. But if you have an advocate, if you have a sponsor, or you're perhaps part of a working group in some respects, you can get people to start giving you a little bit more visibility into what's going on. I mean, I don't want to use silo victimology as an excuse, but it certainly is a contributing factor to a lot of these kinds of things. In one memorable instance, working for a provincial government entity here in Ontario, I was approached about pulling together some training that was for a project release that was going to be happening in 2 weeks. This project had been going on for 6 or 7 months. And it was the first I'd heard that this was on the go, and that there was going to be a training requirement. And he said, well, you can just pull some slides together, can't you?
Oh, wow. No.
And you have to really bite your tongue at times, and I'm sure everybody's done this, to say, please allow me to explain to you the way the training world works. And one of the nice things about that is that I was able to use that as a bit of an advocacy push to say, get training involved when you start your project, not 2 weeks before delivery, because it takes longer than you think to pull stuff together, particularly if it's new. And by the way, please do not expect your trainer to be the subject matter expert. That is not their remit. The only thing they should be a subject matter expert in is L&D.
I think that's a very fair assessment. I mean, it almost reminds me that a lot of times we're involuntary magicians. We seem to bring things together so well, but we really don't want to. We really would love a couple of months instead of a couple of weeks. But
absolutely, absolutely. On my contract for the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I jokingly say to people in the audience, particularly if I'm presenting outside of Canada, it's like, yes, we have one. It was shortly before Christmas, and we received a request to be fulfilled for a whole bunch of gap training modules to be developed and made available by the 1st of February. Now, this was shortly before a 2-week Christmas block leave period.
Of course, well timed.
Of course.
And we said to the folks in Winnipeg who had sent us the request, it's like, we can do a good job for you, but we're going to need more time to do this effectively. They said in military speak, thank you for your feedback, the date stands. So, I mean, when you're in a hierarchical environment, a truly hierarchical environment like that, I mean, yes, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But on that project, we were still in a position to pull off some good stuff. We had some great wins, and the TLDR on that is that I pulled together a team of people who had never worked on e-learning authoring before, trained them on how to use the software for what we needed to do. And between the 5 of us, with me playing lead ID and essentially art director, we produced 29 pieces of e-learning in 14 working days.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, this all looked great. I mean, the wing commander had written commendations for everybody who was involved. And we thought this was actually really cool. We got laptops out of IT on short notice. We got people to help us on short notice. And there were a lot of people who were very much aligned in getting this project done. But where this date became a problem was when the threshold knowledge test, which was required for this gap training, was issued. All 20 participants in the pilot failed the threshold knowledge test.
Oh no.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were a number of other factors that went into that. They were instead of following our guidance to say, let people take this in their own time, space it out, integrate it with their work. No, they pulled them off the various shop floors and force fed them the e-learning modules
Oh no.
over the course of 5 straight days, and then had them write the test.
Oh,
So all of a sudden their April 1st deadline for having this available for all the technicians who needed it across the Air Force, suddenly that date didn't matter anymore.
I'm not
yeah.
surprised.
Isn't that funny?
Right. So
Yeah.
it was frustrating. It was painful, and professionally, it's really hard to see something that you know is not going to end well actually become that,
Yeah.
that fulfilled prophecy. And there's no nice way to say "I told you so." There really isn't. And I mean, in that instance, I took no joy in it.
Yeah.
But we eventually managed to get some better traction and some sanity on the project. And by the time I left, they were moving that contract. They were moving in the right direction, but it still wasn't done.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
So
It's one of the
Ooh.
big challenges, I think. And
is.
especially, you've talked so much with us about managing expectations, which I think is just so core to any level of success. But you've also kind of got me thinking about what happens when you get to the point of saying yes. You will take on this last minute request. You'll do the best you can. And, it even makes me think about an experience I had. This was years ago, but a manager of mine said that we could get, I think it was 5 modules out the door. They were lengthy e-learning modules, 15 to 20 minutes each, in something like 2.5 or 3 weeks. And there's that moment where, I'm sitting at his desk and I'm like, why did you say yes to this? This feels like our first mistake. Why would we do this? And, it kind of gets me thinking, what are some of these common mistakes that you see teams make? Is it saying yes or over-promising and under-delivering? Or are there other, kind of typical mistakes people make that perhaps they can be aware of so that they don't find themselves backed against the wall trying to deliver on something that's just simply not possible with any level of quality?
I think the best umbrella that we can use for that is the concept of risk assessment.
Very good.
If you're going to take it on,
Yeah.
you need to do a risk assessment for what this means for you and for your team if you have one. But you also need to work with your requester to look at any gaps between their expectations, their drivers, and what you're reasonably able to generate in that stretch of time.
Yeah.
And it's something that I picked up from working in heavily project managed environments, is that without doing a good risk assessment and having a sense of the things that could potentially come to bite you, and asking the question, what could happen if ...
Mm-hmm.
And then where do you go from that if that does in fact come to pass? So you try to do as much forward planning as you can. And you're absolutely right, Stephanie, that we've all had instances where we've said, why did I take this? Why did I take this on?
Yes.
But it's also something that speaks to our ability to become better learners and to get out of comfort zones a little bit. We've all seen the various memes that say, hey, when you're outside your comfort zone, this is where the magic happens. Like, okay, yes, but
And
sometimes,
but it could also be where disaster happens, depending on how far away the comfort zone is in your rear view.
Yes.
You want to be able to challenge yourself, because as painful as these things are to endure and to get through, you also have to look at them as opportunities. Now,
Right.
I'm as much of a cynic as the next person. My bumper sticker says, "In case of accident, I'm not surprised."
That's great.
But I try to look at it afterwards and reflect on what's happened. And at the time, on that Air Force project in particular, I was not having a lot of fun. It was long days to get that stuff through. Now I look back on it because I really had to think about what were the wins. Like, I knew it wasn't all bad, and I had to think critically about that. And that approach is something I recommend to people who find themselves in these situations, is that at, where's the opportunity? Where could you drive change? Where could you drive innovation in some of the processes? And if you're in a position to continue to tell those stories to people and say, look, here's what we did, here's what we accomplished, and here were the things that changed to make that happen. And can we look at changing some of those supporting things like, laptop provisioning or something like that, or pulling task forces together and stuff like that. Find out, why don't we do this all the time?
Yeah.
Why did it have to be an emergency?
Yeah. I love the idea of risk assessment. Well, and of course, pushing outside your comfort zone, not to the level of panic zone, right? But within the comfort zone, that stretch zone. Although I know there are some times where we absolutely have to say no, or we're going to do a poor job, right? Or they're heaping so much work on, it's more than one person can handle, or people, or whoever are involved. Any suggestions on how to say no, or to figure out where that boundary is, where you're enabling poor behavior, heaping too much onto you, kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's part of that solution is about actually ensuring that you've got a dialogue happening with people who are going to be sending these things to you. Otherwise, you're essentially turning yourself into an order taker. Which, right. And we all know that is not the role that we want L&D to be performing inside an organization. But there are going to be times where you have to say no. But if you are going to say no, or I'll back that up, if you're going to be giving an answer that is perceived as no,
yes,
make sure that you've got the evidence to suggest why that can't happen. So it's like mini business case. Lay it out properly. Say, here's what's currently in place. Here's what the ask is. My interpretation of the outcomes. Here's the risk of what could take place if this isn't given enough time, if it isn't given enough resources. You may not get the outcomes you want.
Yeah.
And engage in a little negotiation in that, because again, this is about L&D's role within the business and its perceived value to the business. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I might not be able to take this on given these conditions, but under this set of conditions, we might be able to make something work.
Yeah.
Nice.
And that's why I always come back to the deadlines. Like, why? Help me understand why this deadline is so critical. What's the risk to us, or to the learners, or to any other partners if this deadline isn't met? Sometimes it's clearly laid out, particularly if it's something regulatory and all that kind of stuff. And even then, there's often a little bit of room to negotiate. Takes longer, but there may be room to negotiate, and sometimes there's not. And as a practitioner, you're going to have to accept that there's going to be times when you don't have a lot of wiggle room. And make sure that your requester understands the cost to what you're already doing to take on something and give it a much higher priority than what you're doing. It may also be an opportunity to assess what it is you're currently doing and say, have I made this too complicated?
Yes.
I'm building this course. Maybe it just needs to be a reference guide, those kinds of things. So it's certainly possible for you to do that. And that's why I encourage people, particularly newer practitioners, to not panic about getting these things. There are opportunities, even if they're hard to see at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, I'd see opportunities for asking for more resources too.
Yes.
Yes.
And I appreciate the fact that there's a lot of opportunity to be that value add that so many of us aspire to be. And there are opportunities at every phase, including the intake process. The person stops by your desk and says, can we do this? It's that opportunity to perhaps not push back, but invite some appreciative inquiry into the process.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your need. And perhaps at that point, there is that value to say, based on this conversation, maybe you don't need this right now. Let's do something else and build some time to get to the product that you're looking for.
Yeah.
I mean, I love it.
And that's the other thing is that there are always a number of people who are in this conversation. You're going to have the requester, you're going to have potentially a buyer, and you're also going to have a consumer. They may be three very different groups of people.
Oh yeah.
And without understanding those demographics and those roles, that's, you're going to find yourself stuck. And any L&D practitioner who doesn't have a set of questions sort of ready to go when you get any kind of request needs to be thinking about those questions and how they ask them, what answers they're expecting, how to probe deeper into what the request is, and get to a little bit of root cause analysis. I'm not necessarily saying you have to go through like a whole massive needs analysis phase. You might have to short circuit that on short notice projects, and that's one of the costs, right? And accept people to live with the results. But if you're in a position to say, I've got 5 questions that I need to ask you at a minimum about this request.
Yeah.
And let's have a conversation.
I think that is the secret, having a couple of great questions prepared that you can share with them. And I mean, I guess that is a great segue into 3 great final questions that we have
prepared questions.
I hate transitioning into this because I have loved this conversation, but we are at the point where we present to you our final 3 questions of the day. We call these our rapid fire questions. They take no more than about 60 seconds or so to respond to. So what do you think? Do you have 3 more answers that you're willing to share with us today?
I think so.
I'm thrilled to hear it because you're getting the questions anyway. So your first question, give us one book that everyone must read and why.
Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, thank you. That's all-time favorite.
The trilogy in 5 parts.
Yes.
It's been a favorite of mine since I first saw the BBC TV adaptation back in the early 80s. And the reason why I say this is not just because Douglas Adams was probably one of the most brilliant science fiction / comedy writers of his day, but the story still stands. It talks about bureaucracies. It pokes fun at mindless decisions. It reminds us about what Douglas Adams called the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, and how there's so much that connects people, whether they know it or even whether they want it or not. Even to take a look at the rise of AI and decision making that's taken out of our hands, it's worth a read, and it's arguably one of the funniest books. And you can listen to the BBC radio adaptation. It's still available out there for people to listen to. Stephen Fry has done a narration through audiobooks. You can still find the BBC TV adaptations, and of course the books are just great. So it's if you've got to read one book, that would be it.
I wholeheartedly agree. It's actually my favorite book of all time as well. In fact, when I was 10 years old, I stole it from my father's bookshelf, and I'm much older than 10 now, and it's on my bookshelf right down the hallway. It's also the reason, by the way, that I always take a towel with me when I travel. Always know where your towel is.
Always know where your towel is.
Okay, I barely want to ask you the other questions. I am going to do it, but that's probably one of my favorite answers. Tell us about one tool that you can't live without.
I have a hard time narrowing it down, so I'm going to rely on the safety of distance, and I'm going to give you 2. I actually, one, if I was pressed, a notebook and an erasable pen. Whether that is one of my smart books like a Rocket book, which I'm rather fond of, or whether it's just a simple notebook with my pens, I tend to live by pen and paper in spite of having all sorts of scheduling apps and all that kind of stuff. But taking time to sketch out ideas, getting away from the technology, for me has been a plus. I think some of that goes to my graphic design background, coming up with new ideas. But I tend to be a visual thinker in that regard. And so that, by extension, leads me to the other tool that I find it very difficult to live without, and that is Miro, the virtual whiteboard.
Yep.
I have used Miro successfully in times when I'm doing planning for groups, and I can take a picture of the Post-its that are on the wall and pull them into a Miro board that now everybody can share and comment on. It's one of the subscriptions that I pay for with my consulting business that is absolutely cheap at twice the price.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just invited a client to try it not too long ago, and I think their world was changed, and I'm very pleased about that. So it is. It's an incredible tool.
It is. It is, absolutely.
Our last question for you today is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
1988, I was a very young instructor in the Army Reserve here in Canada at a wonderful garden resort called Canadian Forces Base Petawawa. And I had taken my leadership course earlier that summer, and I was teaching. Actually, I was on the staff teaching basic officer training, which was, quite a thing for a 20-year-old newly minted instructor to do. And the captain who was in charge of our course, certainly saw my enthusiasm for the task, and he said to me, he was actually a teacher in civilian life, and he said, "Don't be afraid to screw up."
Ooh.
He said, it's going to happen. Striving, essentially the message was that, striving for perfection and then giving all of yourself because it didn't go as planned is not healthy. So accept the fact that you're going to make mistakes and just commit to learning from them. But that little piece, don't be afraid to screw up, really changed my perspective on how I taught, how I prepared for teaching, and how I looked at learning from feedback that I would receive on monitoring as a young instructor, and something that I carried on when I started teaching other people how to become instructors in the military. I give them exactly the same advice.
I love it.
I do too.
Oh, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
No, thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Are you interested in learning more about the Metro DC chapter of ATD or following us on social media? Go to dcatd.org and click on About.
Would you like to be even more involved in our wonderful community? Go to dcatd.org and click on Volunteer to get started.